welcome back to All Things Money. I'm your host, David Blain. We thank you for joining us on 94.1 FM, WNBU, and Cable TV 10 in New Bern. Today's show is a topic that I feel like needs more emphasis, and we're talking about statistics, notably government statistics. It's put out by the government, and how the headline number does not always reflect the reality. And I used a quote by Yogi Berra, who said that in theory and practice things are equal, but in practice there never are, or something to that effect. And this is a perfect example of that, where the theory and mathematics behind unemployment, inflation, GDP, budgets is great, but in practice there are huge problems with it, and the decision making that's reliant on these numbers is tremendous. And so we want to give you a little bit of information. When you hear these numbers, I want you to think critically about this. And I'm not really a government conspiracist, that I do think there's a lot of problems with the government and they don't give us the full truth, but it's up to the citizens to understand what they're listening to and come up with their own rationale. So we're talking about GDP, a statistic, gross domestic product, and I was saying how most households don't even know what they spend money on. They hardly know how much they make. They know what gets deposited in their checking account, but they don't know pre-tax income. They don't know how much they pay in income tax. They don't know how much they spent on Starbucks coffee. It's impossible. So when you multiply that by 330 million people and you're trying to measure the aggregate output of the U.S., you can see how it could cause a few problems. So once again, in theory, the gross domestic product and the gross domestic income should be equal, but they never are, and the discrepancy is significant. It also never matches the IRS data. Well, that's kind of a whole other story about underreporting and the way that the IRS captures income and you report income. But the point is that GDP does not correlate with some of the other aggregate statistics we have. GDP figures also include imputed growth. A few of the oddities that I think, free checking is included as imputed interest income. Homeowners are calculated to receive imputed rental income. So these two things go into the GDP, imputed interest on free checking and imputed rental income on homeowners. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but that should strike you as kind of odd. The GDP ignores household work, volunteerism, and, of course, the underground economy. There's no way to count it. So there's an old joke that if you married your housekeeper or handyman, that you'd cause the GDP to drop, and it's true. So when you go out and you do landscaping on your yard and you didn't hire somebody, that's not counted. If you go volunteer at the soup kitchen, that's not counted. And there may be some legitimate basis for not counting, but the point is that these are effort that people put in that have some positive outcome that is not counted. The GDP deflator is a inflation measurement that's factored into the GDP to try to adjust for inflation. If you missed the second segment, we just went through a lot of the problems that there are out there with inflation. You can log on to the our website, www.dlblain.com, and pick up the previous segment on the archives there. So if you've got a problem with the inflation statistic and then you're applying that inflation statistic to the GDP and the GDP deflator, you're exacerbating the problems with that statistic. And there's some problems. They used to be fixed weighted inflation. Now it's chain weighted, and this causes the inflation to be understated. Negative things are positive. The cost of crime and natural disaster are excluded from GDP. But when you build a prison, that's positive GDP, and if you rebuild after a disaster, that's positive GDP, but you didn't take into account that you destroyed something as well. The other thing that's sort of odd, GDP used to be measured as the GNP, gross national product. And in I think the change was made in the early 90s. They went from GNP to GDP, and because the GDP punished debtor nations like the U.S. over the GNP, a little something that was changed there in 91. Not just the U.S., the majority of the world uses GDP now, but once again, it used to be what's called a GNP, and which would punish the debtor natives, so they switched to GDP. Another statistic, retail sales. The survey is fairly thorough. It includes 5,000 firms, and then they have an advanced survey that has 12,000 firms, and it tracks the dollar value of sales, not the changes in unit volume. And so once again, the inflation number gets into that retail sales number. So if the dollar value went up, but maybe the units went down because of inflation, well, did you really sell more goods and services? No. If you sold 20 TVs last year at $500, and this year you sold 15 TVs at $1,000, did you really, did the output of the country really go up? I would submit that no, it didn't. So once again, there's that inflation number creeping into the data that can really skew the numbers. So that's the retail sales. Deficit accounting. We've got about a minute left here. We'll talk a little bit about deficit accounting. You hear a lot about the accounting of the deficit and the budget. The U.S. uses a form of cash accounting that uses Social Security surpluses as revenue, but does not factor in accruals. The cash basis deficit, as an example, in 2010 was about $1.3 trillion. If you calculated the same number using GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting procedures, all the CPAs out there will know what that is, the deficit would have been on the order of $2.1 trillion. So the government accounting, the way they do it is really odd. And of course, it would be tremendously higher if they used the actuarial assumptions for unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities. Those are completely excluded. And this gets hammered home a little bit more in the press, but you can see there are tremendous problems with the way the government accounts for things. As I alluded to previously, this is not just the United States. There are problems with all the countries when they report the data. And China, frankly, who knows what they're reporting, if any of it is accurate. They could just be making it all up. So I want you to be skeptical of the statistics you hear. Do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. I hope you join us again next week for All Things Money.
The proceeding was a paid program. The opinions expressed are not necessarily those of WNBU and Inner Banks Media.